We've come to London's Charing Cross Road, near the corner of Old Compton Street, to the exact spot where our document was found 14 years ago. The letter, which was neatly handwritten on a sheet of lined memo paper, was picked off the pavement by Jane Ray, then a trainee radio journalist. It refers to the closure of a geriatric hospital in Neasden, about 6 miles from here, and it seems to imply that the closure was more imminent than either staff or patients realised.
Laurie Pavitt has been on the phone to me. He feels that the precipitative removal of patients would make for a difficult atmosphere for the joint working party. I said that I thought clinical considerations were beginning to assert themselves.
Laurie Pavitt was then the MP for Brent South. No one could have been trying harder to save Neasden Hospital. He wanted to set up a working party to look at alternatives to closure. Lorne, the man who dropped the letter, is Lorne Williamson, then manager of Brent District Health Authority.
I think that as a PR exercise, it would help the Minister if you could make a point of ringing or seeing Pavitt and take him through the problems, without appearing to preempt the Minister's own decision. OK?
The Health Minister at that time was Tony Newton, and the letter is signed David. Handwriting analysis confirmed that this is David Kenny, then manager of North West Thames Regional Health Authority, a government appointee who in effect was Lorne's boss and a link in the chain of command to the Health Minister. Our journalism student was sufficiently bothered by the document to keep it on file all these years. Where does our story start? Probably with the appointment of the recipient of our letter, Lorne Williamson. The manager of Brent District Health Authority was, in 1985, one of a new breed. As the then Vice-Chairman of Brent DHA, Methodist Minister Reverend David Haslam had been at least partly responsible for the birth.
Mr. Williamson came out of a business background. I think he'd been making health products of some kind. I, in fact, was one of the interviewing panel for him, and we had this change from a cooperative consensus style of management to a more business style of management. And so managers who'd been in the health service all their lives were ditched in favour of people applying from outside. The regional health authority and the government wanted someone who would pursue, as they saw it, the economics of the situation.
But what of the patients there? Neil Lewis told us about his grandmother, May Watkins.
I remember being away on holiday and coming back to find that grandmother had broken her leg. She had, with the osteoarthritis that she had brittle bones as well, and she was taken away to have it fixed. And grandmother was in Neasden, I suppose, for about 18 months.
During this time, it became clear that Neil's grandfather, Harold, was dangerously ill with cancer. So Neil visited May in hospital and asked her to record a special birthday greeting for him.
OK, then.
Happy birthday, dear little Dad.
Happy birthday, dear little Dad, she says.
Dad.
Then,
Right.
when am I likely to see him again?
Be likely to see him.
Don't know.
In this life, she never did.
OK.
Neil's grandfather, Harold, died a week later. May, by this point, needed 24-hour care, or continuing care in medical jargon, and those were the last words we'll hear May speak.
I remember those ladies.
May was cared for by nurses such as Sister Leslie Giles. Neasden was Leslie's first nursing post, and she still has a drawer full of old photographs from those days.
This lady couldn't see very well. She was a little cross-patched, but she was so sweet. And this lady was Greek. I got a Greek phrase book. I've still got it to try and communicate with her, but my accent must have been terrible because she couldn't understand me. This lady used to hit me. I'd be tying her shoelaces and she'd wallop me. I think she's reaching out there to try and do the same. But she was gorgeous. And they just had no voice. If we didn't stand up and say something, nobody asked them what they wanted, which is very bad, very bad.
Neasden Hospital was a very close community hospital, with the staff and with the community around.
Nurse Nell Walsh remembers the feelings of warmth and companionship in a hospital that was more like a hospice.
The grounds were absolutely beautiful. We had orchids, trees, apples, fruits, and these old days they used to like being pushed around the grounds, We had tennis courts
walking in the grounds was exhilarating.
Nurse Mavis Francis.
You could hear the birds, you could go into the orchards. It was a lovely place.
Though it has to be said that at the time there were some fairly good arguments being made in favour of closure. The building was old, and so maintenance costs were high. Its site covered 10 acres, but served less than 100 patients. And as for its tennis courts, well, they weren't exactly overused by the hospital's geriatric patients. Then there's the fact that public transport links were poor. Selling the site was in keeping with the Kerry Davis report of 1983, which had called on NHS managers to boost resources by flogging off underused land. The Griffiths report of the same year also encouraged the recruitment of private sector managers, like Lorne Williamson, to make the NHS more efficient. Added to all this was a growing acceptance of the belief that the job of the NHS was to cure people, not look after the elderly. Professor Jane Lewis of Oxford University is an expert on community care and health policy.
If you look at the period between 1983 and the mid-1990s, you've got a 38% fall in the number of NHS beds available for continuing care. That's a huge fall. And you don't have a parallel development in community care provision. And what we increasingly see, of course, is the crunch. Cases such as Neasden, you're looking at one crunch that comes rather early, actually, in 1986. We see far more crunches in the 1990s in terms of this battle then over responsibility for people who seem to be falling between the cracks of health and social care.
So, sensing that the closure of Neasden Geriatric Hospital was imminent, whatever the objections, campaigners decided to take the sort of radical action that had saved other hospitals from closure.
This building here is symbolic of the cuts the government is making in the health service.
On October the 17th, protesters move in and take over the hospital.
This building, which served the people of London for so many years, is going to be handed back to private developers, handed back to people to make a great deal of money out of it, handed back as part of the destruction of London's health service.
But nearly 2 months later, the health unions COSI and UPI are forced to drop their backing for the action after the health authority brings out a court injunction against them. The occupation crumbles, much to the utter dismay of union activist Pete Marshall.
Myself and my colleague Mark Irvine had to go down there and remove all the NUPI and COSI placards and explain to people personally. I mean, I was close to tears. And there was a demonstration the next day and we had to stand on the other side of the road. We couldn't join the demonstration.
The battle now goes on behind closed doors.
They kept changing where they were having the meetings, and sometimes they had them in deliberately small rooms so that they could then, for fire regulation reasons or whatever, refuse entry to the public.
Marianne Craig, then Secretary to Brent Community Health Council.
I very strongly believe that they wanted to get on with the business of closing services, making the cutbacks, balancing the books as they were told to do by the government, and they didn't want the messiness of public consultation.
The District Health Authority was winning the battle, but not without casualties. Shortly after ending the occupation of Neasden Hospital, its chairman, financier Ivan Kingston, resigns, exhausted by many months of criticism and abuse from campaigners. He's replaced by Dr. Martin McNichol. Unlike Mr. Kingston, Dr. McNichol can't be accused of being an outsider with little interest or knowledge of patient care. A respected physician, he'd been associated with the hospital since 1962. He believes that if anyone was using unsavoury tactics in the Neasden campaign, it was the protesters, not the health authority.
We had performances where we had to have the police there to keep public order. We had meetings which were broken up by having the public, in inverted commas, up on the tables shouting at us. Extremely stressful. Unless you learn how to live with it, then one can play games and live with it. But we were clearly being used as a pawn in a political game against the government.
Who was doing the using?
Well, I would strongly suspect it was Brent Council. Brent Council was then hard left and were not prepared to accept government policy about the health service.
And then, 7 weeks after our letter was found, on the 12th of November 1986, the then Health Minister, Tony Newton, announced that he'd made a decision about Neasden. He had decided that the hospital should be knocked down and the land sold off for housing development. It was marvellous news, said the press release.
I am satisfied that the Health Authority has planned the transfer of patients very carefully, and that this decision represents the first step in an imaginative development of services for elderly and disabled people in Brent. The authority plans to improve its range of services for people in the neighbourhood by establishing a network of 3 resource centres in the district, which will provide help and backup for disabled and elderly people in need of local healthcare facilities. The first resource centre is planned for Wembley Hospital at an estimated cost of £5 million. The proceeds from the sale of the Neasden site will go towards this.
Nursing staff are told patients must be moved in 3 weeks' time. Strangely, £350,000 has already been spent on refurbishing 2 wards for them at Wembley and Central Middlesex hospitals. Then came the move on a cold day just 3 weeks before Christmas 1986. Ambulance workers refused to cross picket lines, so coaches had to be called in to bus the patients out. The Reverend David Haslam, who had been vice-chairman of the District Health Authority but was demoted after criticising local health service cuts, remembers the day police moved in to supervise the removal of patients from Neasden.
The day the patients moved out was a very traumatic day. It was an appalling situation for anybody who was involved in health care, and particularly with concern for geriatric care. When that kind of railroading operation took place, the police came in and sort of blocked out any kind of protest and just made it possible for contractors to come in this case a coach company, who were brought in to take elderly people away in very unsuitable vehicles. They are going to be moved no matter what, because power and authority say so.
Aside from the manner of the patient's removal, the campaigners' biggest concern was the timing of it all, bang in the middle of winter. But they only have themselves to blame for holding things up, according to the newly appointed chairman of the District Health Authority, Dr. Martin McNichol.
The circumstances in which we got out of Neasden were messy and difficult in the extreme. And if we had been able to carry through our plans at the time we wished to carry them through, then that wouldn't have happened, and the whole process would have been much more orderly. But, okay, the people that were doing it said this was for the benefit of the patients and all that sort of stuff, but what they managed to do was to set up something which was pretty stressful for all concerned, including the patients.
So you're saying all the protests meant that the period where people were supposed to be moved out drifted into winter because you couldn't get on with it before?
Yes, I'm saying that. Yes, I am, yeah.
No regrets at all?
I don't. I regret that we had the political storms. I think that the things were messy, but what we did was right, and I'm sure it was absolutely right to take a stand on that sort of issue.
Dr. McNichol even hints that had he failed to deliver, his own authority could have suffered financial penalties.
Because if you don't deliver, life can be made less comfortable for you. There are quite a lot of discretion around the margins on whether there's additional finance made available for this or that or the other. It's standard organisational games, never specific, but nevertheless it's there.
Dr. McNichol, OBE, did meet his targets and is now retired. But what of May Watkins? Her family don't recall being told that the hospital was about to be closed, nor do they remember getting any letters on the subject. Instead, they heard about it on the grapevine, but accepted it was for the best and would be handled well.
We were led to believe, however, that the move to Central Middlesex initially was going to be by ambulance, and then subsequently heard that it was by bus or by coach.
May's grandson, Neil Lewis.
And in the move, it was done badly. She was, amongst the others, I suppose, left on the pavement. Frail old lady who couldn't do anything for herself, didn't really speak a lot anymore, couldn't say she was in pain or hot or cold or anything, couldn't move, she got manhandled. And when I next saw her, I was called into the ward in the Central Middlesex Hospital to be told that she was dying and it would be a matter of hours. She was covered in bruises. I sat with her and I held her hand and told her I was there, and then I felt it being squeezed, and I'm sure I did. And then she, sort of relaxed, and that was that.
May died 2 days after the move on the 8th of December 1986. The official cause of death was bronchial pneumonia.
Okay. I'm just going to give you these forms, Jay, so that you can...
I next went to see Dr. Charles Cayley, who is the consultant in charge of Neasden's geriatric patients. He's now Clinical Director of Elderly Care at Central Middlesex Hospital. So, what does a man respected by both protesters and doctors alike think of the decision to enforce the removal of patients from Neasden in the depths of winter?
In principle, the reorganisation of the service was right. The timing was wrong. It was in the middle of winter, and we hadn't actually managed to achieve staff consensus on the desirability of a change in pattern of service.
There was supposed to be a consultation process going on throughout that period, though. Did you get the feeling that people were really listening to concerns like yours and those expressed by other people?
No, I don't think people were listening.
And it seems that people have gone on not listening. May Watkins' medical records, and those of other patients who died shortly after the move, were destroyed as a matter of course 6 years ago. But Dr. Cayley told us of other, more recent examples of patients' lives being put at risk through what has come to be known as the relocation factor. And a quick trawl through the archives of the Health Service Ombudsman did indeed give cause for concern. In 1996, 24 elderly patients with dementia were moved from Park Pruitt Hospital in Hampshire to a private nursing home. 3 died within the first month. A year later, Barnet Health Authority also moved 24 elderly patients, this time from Knapsbury Hospital in Hertfordshire to a private nursing home. Within 2 weeks, 7 were dead. Meanwhile, the Reverend David Haslam had carried out his own investigation into what effect the move had on Neasden's elderly patients.
We did follow up the closure of Neasden by asking, well, what happened to the patients involved? And it does appear some patients did die in the months after the transfer. And looking at the minutes, I'm reminded that there was a kind of fuzzy answer from the medical officer responsible as to exactly what the numbers were, because winter meant that there were more deaths anyway, and so on. They didn't feel that the variation in number was significant. Well, I don't think any of us were satisfied with that answer at the time, I have to say.
Neither is the Home Office Minister Paul Boateng. In 1986, he was a health activist on the Neasden campaign. A year later, he took over from Laurie Pavitt as MP for Brent South.
When you uproot old people from established and understood surroundings, you run a health risk. And at that age, you run a risk with their lives. And I didn't believe that was acceptable. And indeed, subsequently, when, as a government, we came into office in 1997, as a health minister with colleagues, we changed the guidelines in order to ensure that clinical considerations did actually take priority, rather than the dictates of convenience, bureaucracy, or the market. And I believe it was right to change the guidelines. And I was undoubtedly influenced in my attitude at the time by experience I had had as a young man, as a campaigner in Neasden.
And I have a copy of those guidelines here, and it does clearly state there should be no winter moves and ample consultation periods should always be given. But at least Lorne Williamson and Health Secretary Tony Newton had promised Neasden's former patients a shiny new resource centre for the elderly in Wembley as compensation for it all. The District Health Authority said it would be fully up and running by 1989. So, was it? I set off for Wembley. On entering a bright new health centre full of glass and veneered wood, I ask a member of staff where I can find the specialised centre for the elderly.
But that's long ago closed down, since last year.
So there's nothing at all for the elderly?
Not here, definitely.
Undeterred, I set off to see if I can find the geriatric resource centre for myself. Right round the back here, there's even more overgrown vegetation. I think we can see in through the windows, just over here. Yes, this is what looks like a geriatric hospital ward. An old sink and some hospital equipment, but none of it working. A sorry sight. I later discovered that the old geriatric ward I'd just seen had once been the temporary home for some of the patients removed from Neasden, but it was now awaiting demolition. While the rest of the site does have an impressive new GP centre with a cafe, minor injuries clinic and children's unit, there are no beds and nothing specifically for the elderly. So, where did the money raised from the sale of Neasden Hospital go, and how much did the Health Authority get for it? I put these questions to the man who dreamed up the idea of selling it, Lorne Williamson.
We expected to sell and needed to sell the site for 2 million, 2.1 seems to be in my mind, in order to get the capital to rebuild at Wembley.
Did you get that amount of money?
Eventually, when the site was sold, I believe £10 million was raised.
And what happened to that money?
Well, I'm sorry to say that money was initially absorbed in the overspend on the building and rebuilding of the Chelsea and Westminster Hospital.
While the Chelsea and Westminster Hospital may be a bright, shiny centre of excellence and even boasted an appearance in the romantic comedy film Jack and Sarah, it didn't do much for former Neasden patients like May Watkins from Cricklewood, who was promised so much more.
I think that was a lesson that I learnt, because coming in from industry, one had been accustomed to making commitments that had some degree of legal binding. And really, I came to the conclusion after that the government was about as trustworthy as Arthur Daly. I had given my assurances to community groups in Brent that when the site was sold, the facilities would be rebuilt. And I felt annoyed and let down that did not happen.
At this point, I decided it was time to show Mr. Williamson our letter. There's a letter here I can show to you, written by David Kenny to you, in which he seems to be putting pressure on you to steamroller things through. And at the end, he alludes to the idea that maybe you should make it appear like the consultation process is being adhered to and the Minister's decision isn't being preempted, which seems to suggest the Minister had made his decision.
Looks as though I lost that document, doesn't it? Well, public consultation in the health service at that time, and I suspect still, takes place after a decision has been made, and that decision can be reversed if the Minister gets cold feet and backs down. I think if you wish to prevent or make changes to the health service from a community point of view, it is essential to influence before the formal consultation procedure has gone on.
So the lesson to be learnt here is that if you want consultation to work, get in quickly before you're consulted. Otherwise, you've left it too late.
I'm sorry that the funding didn't go as we had promised, and that I regret. Probably indirectly was the reason that I left the health service.
Lorne Williamson. A date was set for MP Laurie Pavitt's joint working party to meet to discuss the future of Neasden. That date was the 11th of December, 4 days after the closure. If the veteran campaigner were alive today, we would have asked him if our letter could have made a difference. I showed it instead to a man who had been one of his closest friends, retired MP for Brent East, Reg Freeson.
It's curious. Yeah, very curious. Even the fact that it's on this kind of paper raises questions, doesn't it? There's no heading, no indication of its source.
Right, it's not on headed notepaper.
Got no source, no date. We would have been very angry about it. What the hell's going on would have been the attitude, to put it bluntly. There would have been quite a stir about it, and it might have helped us to win the battle, or at least get it reshaped.
What do you think Laurie Pavitt would have felt about this letter had he seen it?
I think he would have been annoyed, and he no doubt would have got on the phone to me and said, look, we must get to see the minister. Now, if there is a process to be gone through, then it should be honestly gone through, irrespective of what the outcome might be, however much I may argue on that basis. And I think he and I would have said, we're not having this.
The rich irony of it all is that opinions on community or cottage hospitals seem to have come full circle since Neasden was closed. Nowadays, big hospitals are going out of fashion, and smaller ones seem to be in again. Stephen Dorrell, who was Health Secretary between 1995 and 97, says that even by the time he took office, there was no question of repeating the Neasden experience, although he seems to have forgotten that the district managers he criticises were merely carrying out his government's policy at that time.
I certainly think it was a mistake in the mindset of some NHS managers, not by any means all, but some, in the 1980s and perhaps into the early 90s, to believe that hospital care should all be centralised into large high-tech hospitals because this is where the numbers of patients could be brought together to have efficient use of resources, efficient use of clinicians and so forth. I think that was a mistake. I was pleased that in my time as Health Secretary I was actually able not just to reprieve old cottage hospitals and community hospitals, but actually to open new ones that had been purpose-built for the service. I think the case for an intermediate level of care is being continued and developed, I believe, in the health service today, and I think that's absolutely right.
As far as we know, no more letters like ours have been found in the street. But how can we be sure that behind closed doors, the same sort of charade isn't determining health policies all over again? Paul Boateng.
We're not complacent and we remain vigilant. But I think lessons were learnt. So things have got better. But they've got better because of the struggles of history. And that struggle around that little geriatric hospital in Neasden helped shape today.